everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Office Hours. It's so nice to have you here. I hope you have brought your GM notebook and some questions, because today we're going to talk about role-playing games, which, if this is a surprise to you, if you tuned in and you're like, what role-playing games? What is this madness? Well, I don't really know what to tell you. It's just kind of the thing that we do here. The way Office Hours works is every episode, I answer 3 questions from you, my audience, submitted in advance so that I can pick through them and pick the good ones at my website, www.adam-koble.com. You can click on the Office Hours link. So if you're sitting here and you realize, like, I have a question for Adam, I have something I really want to know, go to the website, fill out the form. You can record your voice if you like. I like it when you do, but it's okay if you don't. And we will answer your question in a future episode. So today I have questions from Paul, but not that Paul, Roscoe, and Hawfunk, all about playing role-playing games. And I suppose there's nothing left for it than to begin. So our first question comes from Roscoe, and I will let Roscoe ask it, and then we can talk about it.
Hello, Adam. My name is Bishop, but I use the handle Reverend Roscoe online. I started my foray into role-playing games 10 years ago with D&D 3.5, and I've been watching your content since you first started on roleplay. I'm particularly a fan of your GM prep and first look videos because they clarify pretty well how the rules of different systems should work. Unfortunately, this kind of content does not exist for all games. Now, I say this because I found lately that when reading the rulebook for a new game or system, that the content just doesn't seem to sink in the way it did when I first started playing role-playing games. Do you have any tips or advice for a GM who has difficulty parsing out the rules of a new game or system from the book? Basically, how the hell do you grok new rules on the first pass the way that you do?
So, this is a thing that happens, and it happens more and more the older you get. And I picked this question and our third question, and really the second question as well, they're all kind of about how our brains experience games. They're about either coming to games from a place where we don't know them yet and we want to know them, or from a place where we want to know something new, right? So this first question, the reason I kind of wanted to dig into it is because it is totally normal for us to lose brain elasticity over time, right? It's totally normal for us to have an easier time learning something when we are young than when we're old. This is just like a function of most humans' brains. Some people are really lucky and they retain that deep level elasticity all the way through. They can, easily learn a new language in their 40s. They can pick up new skills easily as they go. But that idea of, like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, really it should be, as the dog becomes older, the tricks become harder to internalize. This is just a brain chemistry thing. And if you're interested in how that works, you will need somebody who is an expert in the brain. I, unfortunately, am not. I have one. I have my whole life. I've used it to varying degrees, but I don't know exactly how this stuff works. So if you're interested, looking into exercises or practices that you can do to retain mental elasticity can be helpful, not just for learning new skills as you get older, but also just generally it'll help keep your brain limber. So that's something that we can do in a general sense, right? This idea that as we get older, as we do more things, our brain kind of gets less and less elastic and less capable of learning new things easily. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't learn new things, right? There is a problem that sometimes people have where we correlate the difficulty of learning new skills with this idea that we just cannot learn them, right? So, like, when you're a kid, if your childhood was anything like mine, your teachers and your parents made you try a lot of different things, right? They were like, try fencing, try theater, try writing, try sports, like all of these various things. And as a child, it was like, okay, I'll try that. I figure it out. I play it. I do it. I decide if I like it or not, and I move on to the next thing. And it seemed as a kid like relatively easy to pick up new stuff. I look back at being 10 and playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and I think, how in the hell did my 10-year-old brain manage to get me to a place where I could learn and understand a game as complex and poorly written as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like that is just marvelous to me. And I think as I get older, I realize like part of that is just the ease to which young brains adapt to new situations and in this case, games, right? Learning new things. Now, as we get older, we feel more resistance from our own brain in learning things. And this can lead, if we don't challenge it or push back on it, then it can lead to a place where we only play one role-playing game. We only watch one kind of TV show. We only like one sort of food. And we sort of just back away. When we feel our brain being resistant, right? We try to learn Spanish, and 2 weeks in, we can't understand a conversation. We get frustrated and we say, you know what? I can't be bothered. My brain just won't learn this, and we put it away. I think that in role-playing, this is part of what leads to the sort of stultifying or freezing up of people learning new games as they get older, right? You find people who are just like, well, this one game is the one game that I'm good at. I understand how this game works. I am never going to play another game, right? I'm just going to play this game because I understand it, and learning new games, it's hard. My brain is resistant to it, and that makes me angry because it makes me feel frustrated, and I don't like feeling frustrated, so I'd rather just play the game that I already know, the end. And if you're doing that intentionally, if you're making this decision because you have a limited amount of time to play games or a limited interest in learning new games, that's fine, right? Like, I'm not saying that finding your niche and sticking to it is wrong. I'm just saying if you're interested in trying new stuff, don't be discouraged by the fact that your brain just doesn't want to learn new things. Like, you have to fight not only the innate level of having a hard time learning a new thing, but also recognizing that your brain is getting worse at it the older you are, right? So really, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, this doesn't matter to me because I'm 16 and I can learn whatever I want, whenever I want. No. It will happen. You will get worse at learning. Learn now while you can. Try new things. Experiment. Be weird. Give your brain some space to run around before it starts to petrify as you become a wizened creature of darkness like myself. Give yourself some room to learn new stuff. And as you get older, and this is true for everybody, as you get older, just keep trying new stuff, right? Be willing to challenge yourself. Now, what I think is interesting about Roscoe's question here is that Roscoe presumes that I am able to, using Roscoe's terminology, grok, which is to say, understand new rule systems simply by looking at them, right? That I have some kind of protocol or tool for parsing out the rules of a game on my first glance. And like anything, here's the trick. Learning itself is a skill. Right? The more you do it, the better you become at it. You can learn to learn so you can learn things better, if that makes sense. So for me, it's not so much that I'm just innately somehow more talented at reading role-playing games, which is a sort of a pointless thing to be talented at, but I seem to have made a go of it. It's not even that. It's also not that I'm just better at learning or that I have some kind of secret trick. It's that the thing that I learn is new role-playing games, right? I have trained my brain to learn how to understand role-playing games because I do it a lot, right? It's not about, having a special trick. It's just about practice. I read a lot of role-playing games. I make an attempt to understand them, and I've created a sort of framework for doing that, right? You'll notice if you watch a RPG first look, I really only look for a few things, right? I look at the three questions. I go looking for what is the game about? How is it about that? What are we rewarded for when we play it? Those things are my framework for going into the game. And then I look at how setting and system interact. Now, when I do that, that looks like I'm understanding the game, but really I'm just testing a hypothesis, right? All I'm doing is skimming the surface, and you can kind of see this happening. And I chose Roscoe's question now specifically because we're starting a new game, right? I specifically chose this because I am currently going through the awkward, sometimes exciting, almost always process of learning a new game, not only by reading it, but by playing it. And I think that honestly, if all you do is what I do, if all you do is read games and try to understand the rules from reading them and then set them aside, I think you're doing a disservice to role-playing games, because you really can't understand the rules of a game until you see them in action. At least that's been my experience, right? Like, there are so many games that reading them, I was curious and I was enjoying about reading them, but it all felt like a hypothesis. It all felt like maybe this will be cool in play. Maybe I think I know what this means. And then playing games is to me like a revelation, right? And yeah, if you watch the first couple of episodes of Eat the Rich, it's clear that we are all as a group learning the game together, right? That for me, I can understand a game's high level, but really getting into the game and understanding it requires practicing multiple times, right? Running through the game, engaging in those systems, and bumping up against the mechanisms in play. Because I think ultimately that's what really matters, right? Is being able to see it hit the road. So the problem with that is that there is kind of there's a buy-in required, right? There's a difference between flipping through a book and trying to figure out the answer to the 3 questions, and then playing the game in terms of the amount of emotional and mental energy that it requires. So yeah, you can't do a one-shot of every single game you're interested in. So what you can do is come up with a basic framework for understanding role-playing games. Understanding why you want to understand them, right? Are you looking at them so you can find a game to play? Are you looking at them so you can pick them apart for your own designs? Are you looking at trying to understand games so you can move their mechanisms into another game, right? Are you doing a toolbox kind of thing? Like, why are you reading role-playing games? Why are you interested in them? For me, the framework I've created, right, to parse the rules for a game, parse the understanding of a game, is for the purposes of shows, first looks, and generally maintaining an understanding of what the new games that are out there are about and how they work, right? For me, it's about personal development. It's about the business that I've built around it. And it's also about looking for opportunities, which is why if you watch a first look, you'll see I get to a point where I understand what the game is about. Then I skip to the GM chapter. I figure out what the GMing looks like in the game. And then I kind of look at the game as a holistic object. And if I'm really excited about a game, you'll notice I immediately set into hypothesizing about what it might look like as a show, right? Where I'm like, oh, and then the players could do this and the audience could be involved in that. And you can see that's where I start to imagine that next step. So for you, how you understand a role-playing game and what purpose you have in understanding that game, that's going to reflect on the protocols that you develop for reading through a game. And I think it's a worthwhile question to ask, because there are so many games. And if we want to encourage people to check out new role-playing games, we want to give them the tools to do so, right? Now, 9 times out of 10, people are going to pick up a game in the store, or they're going to look at the page on drive-thru, or they're going to see a tweet about the game, and immediately they're going to say, how is this the same or different from the games that I already play? Which I think leads people down kind of an uncomfortable marketing or advertising path for new games. Because for me, if I'm, say, at Gen Con, and I come up to a booth, and I'm looking at a game that somebody made, and they see me looking at it, and they say, hey, I noticed you're looking at my game. Can I give you the pitch? And I'm like, yeah, go for it. And they say, all right, well, so this game, it's like 5e, but it's set in space. And I'm like, okay, well, I understand that this is your framework for selling it. Or for example, the inverse, if someone comes up to the Burning Wheel booth and they pick up a copy of Dungeon World and they say, what dice system does this use? I always kind of sigh because I'm like, okay, you're trying to understand whether this game is more like Shadowrun or more like GURPS. And you think that me explaining the mechanisms of the game from the get-go will explain it to you. I think for me, understanding what we would call in marketing or in advertising, the value proposition, right? The experiential result of a game. That's what I want to know. I want to know, what is it going to feel like at the table playing this game with my friends? Are we going to be laughing? Are we going to be gasping in surprise? Are we going to be having a deep emotional context? So for me, what I want to know is, what is the game about? And then you can subsequently explain to me how, right? Prove it. Show me the mechanisms that do that. And so what I've done is taken that protocol and I apply it to things like first look videos or my own experiences at a con or in a game store. But Roscoe and everyone else learning who is attempting to keep their brain elastic and giving them the chance to dig into new games, what are you looking for, right? Why do you want to understand a new game? And once you've decided to actually learn the rules, the best way to do it is to try it, right? Either do a one shot and accept that it's going to be a little messy and a little slow, and that's fine, or start a campaign and learn as you go, right? Do that. Continue to process the game in action, right? Actually take the game and play it at the table. And that's for me how I understand rules. Once you get to a point where the rules are curious enough for you that you're interested in, right? Yeah, and don't worry about overloading stuff. And we'll talk about that more kind of when we get into the second question, because it talks a little bit more about that. But for me, tips or advice for somebody who has difficulty understanding the rules, you don't have to do it alone. All you really need is a hook. All you really need is to read enough of the game, flip through enough of the game to understand whether or not it seems interesting to you. I guess this is the thing. If you expect yourself to come to the table and GM a game with book perfect understanding of the rules and how they interact, you will always disappoint yourself and your players. Do not do that, right? Come to the table instead with a curiosity about the system, right? Now, we talk about this a lot, this idea of being curious, this idea of asking questions. I think that you can be curious about a system and decide to play it at the same time, right? In fact, you should, because that's going to allow you to discover new things about the system, discover new interactions that you couldn't have understood before. So try it, right? Get your hands on the game, bring it to the table, say, you know what? Let's see what happens. Let's make some characters and see how that feels. If we like that, let's try the game out, right? I think that's the approach, is this hands-on practical approach. If you don't have time to do that, which a lot of people don't, and a book's like $50 or $60 if it's a big book, and maybe you don't want to spend that on a game. The fast and easy thing is understand why you are reading it in the first place. Are you auditioning it for a new game? Are you trying to steal bits and pieces from it? Come up with that framework in your head, right? Give yourself a model for that learning and then apply that model to a game, right? Now, your model might be different from mine, which is why I can't just say, do this specific thing, but understand it, right? Why do you want to figure this game out, and what's going to get you there most quickly and most easily? And then be gentle with your brain, right? Be kind to your own pace for learning. Playing a role-playing game is about learning the game, right? Even now, 15 years since I first picked up Burning Wheel, I still learn things from playing it, right? I still learn things about 5th edition D&D, and I have sunk thousands of hours, I am sure at this point, into playing and trying to understand that game. So it's not a process that ever ends. You just need to know when it's worth starting. And, chat made a good point too while we were talking about this question. You don't even have to do that yourself, really. Like, if you're curious about a game, it's not even go and check the game out, maybe buy it or borrow it from a library if you have a super cool library. Now, see if you can find an actual play, either a podcast or a YouTube series or a Twitch series, right? Find the equivalent of a Let's Play for this role-playing game and see what you can learn about it, right? tune in at random places if you don't have time to watch the whole thing, right? Check out character creation, find combat, watch a little bit of that. See if there's any GM prep stuff that's available to you to give you a behind the scenes look at the game, right? You're already kind of doing it by looking at first looks, but I haven't covered every single game out there. There are other people who are interested in different games than I am. So go and check that out. And that gives you another extra layer of buffering and another angle in on learning, right? It used to be you could only really learn how to play a role-playing game either from somebody teaching you or from reading the book alone, like a strange kung fu manual. But now we have so many more options for learning a game. So that'd be another thing I would suggest. See if you can find someone who's already playing it and check that out. That's right. We haven't covered every game yet, but we'll get there. All right. So speaking of learning, our second question from Paul, but not that Paul. This Paul has a question about Burning Wheel and about learning things gradually.
Hello, Adam. Thank you for this outlet you provide to the community to submit specific questions. I'm a GM with a few years of experience running D20 systems, D&D and Stars Without Number. My players, except for one, all have experience with those two systems as well. Aside from a few sessions of Dogs in the Vineyard, none of us have used a dice pool system. After hyping the system for several months, I've convinced my players to participate in a Burning Wheel campaign. I know that it will be a big departure compared to their past experiences, so we're starting simple with the hub and spokes, as well as omitting sorcery and limiting character stock to human. I'm fascinated by the complexity that the more advanced systems such as Duel of Wits and Fight provide, but I'm wary of putting too much too soon onto both the players and myself. As a DM with substantial experience working with different groups in Burning Wheel, what are some cues that it's a good time to add another layer of complexity? Should I make a call ahead of time and assign the rules of each subsystem as homework for the players to read in advance? Could I decide that I want to put them in whenever I feel like it and schedule a practice session focusing on the mechanic to introduce, one at a time? I'd like to stoke this lit kindling into a blazing flame rather than smother it with too much too soon. I appreciate your thoughts.
So, first of all, shout outs to Paul's cat in the background. I love it. I was tempted for a hot second to edit out the little meow in the background, but I chose not to. I'm answering this for Paul and their cat. So this is a great question because I'm going to answer it about Burning Wheel because that's what Paul asked for. But I'm also going to try to talk about it in a broader sense, right? In the sense of like, the thing about Burning Wheel, and there are many things about it, it's a complex game that knows it's a complex game that tries to tell you how to learn it in stages. And I honestly don't think that I can think of another role-playing game that says, okay, now stop. I know there's a bunch more book, but don't read it. Just stop right now, come back, and later we'll move on to this next thing, right? Burning Wheel is built on a series of sort of concentric circles of complexity. The internal circle being the most basic mechanics, then slightly more complex mechanics, then more and more and more. So there are structures within the game in Burning Wheel that tell you what to do, but not necessarily when to do it, right? Because it doesn't necessarily you don't reach the same point for every single game. Now, you could do this, right? You could very, very easily do this. Orpheus does this, which is maybe a weird choice to talk about. But so you could very easily say, once the characters reach this thing, introduce this new set of mechanisms, right? You could gate it based on an ongoing narrative. You could base it on advancement. You could base it on number of sessions. So you could say, session 5, introduce this new thing. Session 8, this new thing. Session 12, this one, right? You could do that. Some games might do that, but Burning Wheel wants you to understand as a group when you reach a point where that is interesting to bring into the game, right? Burning Wheel wants you as a group to discuss that and decide it together. Now, I think we'll talk about introducing new mechanics, but in Burning Wheel, especially because it is so character driven and it is so much about the players. And because you're coming to it from D&D and from Pathfinder, you need to think about what is going to be different for your players. What are they going to experience that is different? So the core thing between the two, the differences are, I would say, Burning Wheel is character driven mechanically and thus narratively. It is about what the characters want and do and whether they succeed or fail. That is all. That is what the game is about. Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons tend to be plot driven. They tend to be about what is going on, and the characters tend to be semi-interchangeable in that greater plot, right? So I think to help people ease into that, the most important thing is to do character creation very slowly. Don't rush it. Do it as a group. Make sure everybody understands that it is a part of play and that you're going to take a full session or longer to make your characters. Because part of that is talking about the mechanisms that are going to set you up for the beginning of the game, right? Predominantly, the main rolling mechanism, right? Obviously, they have to understand the rules, which is the dice pool. How do you figure out how many dice you have? You know, what does that look like? What is obstacle? What is success? What is fail forward? And then also intent and task. Now, I think people gloss over intent and task, but the little ritual of the GM saying, what are you trying to do? Here is what skill that sounds like. Make that roll. That little back and forth, clarifying intent and presenting task. That is so, so important to playing Burning Wheel, right? Like that alone, I feel like is the only thing that really needs to sink in the first few sessions, right? But the other thing that you want to do is talk deeply about, and again, I think that because we think of XP and awards in role-playing games, we tend to think of them as an adjunct to play, right? I think we tend to think of them as something that are like, well, I did the thing, now give me my reward, right? It's at the end, it's outside of the game. But for Burning Wheel, everything about the game rotates around and is supported by beliefs, instincts, and traits, right? They are how we get rewarded. You're functionally designing a custom experience model when you make characters, right? When you make your beliefs, you're saying, this is the shit that I want to get Artha for. When you choose your traits, you're saying, this is the character I want to play. When you choose your instincts, you're saying, I'm going to cause trouble or ignore it. Give me Artha. Right. And that's why character creation is so important, because it teaches players this game is about you. It's about your character. Right. It's not about a player character you happen to be filling in for. If your character dies or is removed from play, the whole game shifts. Right. Massive shift in difference. So it's important. The characters matter. So starting there and teaching, I think the base stuff you need is to prove that they understand the rewards model, right? So I wouldn't start complicating Burning Wheel until all of the characters have earned at least a couple of persona, they've earned a bunch of fate, and they know how to create beliefs and to deal with that stuff during the sessions, right? That's what they need to understand. If you feel like they have become comfortable with intent and task and the reward model, great. Now you can start adding new stuff. I would start by adding resources and circles, which A, are my favorite mechanisms, circles especially. And then B, they're basically just skill rolls or attribute rolls, right? They're not anything too much more complicated. So I would say that's the next layer is resources and circles. You're still resolving violence with either a bloody versus test or something like that, or an extended test maybe. You're still resolving all of that stuff with the core rules. And then from there out, all that really matters is beliefs, right? Like you may go an entire campaign without ever using fight or range and cover, especially range and cover, right? There are only very rare circumstances where a character has a belief about a battle big enough for that to matter. And that's what counts, right? Bringing into the game duel of wits or fight or range and cover, don't do it unless somebody's beliefs are at stake, right? Because it's just not worth it. If you're trying to convince someone of something, just let them make a persuade roll unless convincing this person is part of their beliefs, right? And again, the reason why you do this as kind of the second arc or the third arc is to lower the stakes, right? So let me explain really quickly what I mean. So let's imagine it takes about 10 to 12, say it takes about 10 to 12 sessions to learn the reward struggle, right? To learn the system, to figure out how you get Artha. You get to the end of the 12th session, people are going to have a fair amount of fate, and they're going to have a fair amount of persona probably by that point, because the system demands duel of wits and fight and those extended conflicts to draw those points out of the characters, to give them a bunch of roles all at once. So by the time you get to the point where players are ready to engage that system, the stakes are lowered because they have lots of fate and lots of persona that they can spend to get through those systems. And I think that's the other thing, is consider in your mind what the stakes are of any given thing and try to give players a low stakes opportunity to learn those rules. Don't do your first duel of wits and say, if you lose this duel of wits, your character will be thrown in jail and summarily executed. Don't do that, right? Give them a low stakes thing that's still connected to one of their beliefs or their instincts. Like if for example, if they have an instinct that says, whenever I hear someone talk about religion, say something obnoxious, right? Trigger that, right? Give them a little thing, like annoying a priest is a lot lower stakes than fighting a legal battle to keep yourself alive, right? Do this for fight, do this for range and cover, do this for duel of wits, do this for resources. Like, let them buy something that isn't going to destroy their life if they fail, right? If they roll circles, evoke the enmity clause, right? Be sure to lower the stakes, give them an opportunity to fail that doesn't feel like the end of the world. Now, in my experience, there are some players for whom failure, no matter what the stakes are, high or low, is going to drive them up the wall. They do not like to fail. They don't like to feel like they don't understand the system. You can tell that kind of player, hell, you can tell everybody in the group, we're getting to a point where I want to start introducing these new mechanics. I'm interested. So it sounds to me like you're playing a lawyer and you're playing a priest and you're playing a mercenary. Lawyer and priest, it might be worth polishing up on the duel of wits rules. Maybe read that chapter. Now that you have some context for how the dice work, go ahead and read that. Mercenary, if you're planning on getting on any fights with anybody, getting in a duel maybe, read the fight rules, right? You can give them a little bit of forewarning, but I wouldn't say assign it as homework. Just tell them, we're going to do this thing, and you know what? We're going to eventually get into these mechanics. So maybe be ready for that. You can also, if you have players who are reticent to try something for real, right? Because there is a risk, right? The risk of failure, the risk of character injury. There is a risk in play. That's what Burning Wheel is about. That's what role-playing games are about. If there is a risk and they are afraid or uncertain about that risk, what you can do is you can run a practice fight with them. You can do a mock battle. You can say, you know what? Just bring your character to the next session and we'll just try it out. We'll try duel of wits. We'll try fight. We can just pretend like it's for real and see what it does, right? And I did that with Burning Wheel. We held the mock fight, Andrew and I, right? We did that. And I think it's a nice way to let people learn the system without putting them on the spot in a way that really, really matters, because that can be intimidating. Yeah. So, with Burning Wheel particularly, it is a complex system. There are nested layers, but Luke and company have done a pretty good job of telling you where those layers are. If you're looking at other complex games, they may not be as clear about how to engage specific mechanisms. For me, I'll use a real example. So Zweihander, right? Now, I read the game and I got a general idea of the mechanisms. So in this case, I learned how do the dice rolls work? Success and failure, how does that work? How does peril or corruption or alignment work? How does character creation work, right? That's all I read. I didn't read combat. I didn't read magic. I didn't get into any of that stuff, right? So I learned just what I needed for the base game and for the first session for character creation. And then between the first and the second session, I created a situation in which we would get to test the mechanisms of the game and combat against basically totally inept enemies, right? I wanted to give the players the opportunity to see how combat works, to potentially be threatened, but not to have to deal with like very high stakes. I knew that even if they lost, it wouldn't be a big loss, right? That these characters couldn't beat them in a fight. And so I gave my players an opportunity to ease into that situation with low stakes. And then I learned the additional rules. And while that was happening, I mentioned to the players, I said, your character can cast spells. Why don't you go and check out the spell rules for me, right? Find the stuff that is important to your character. You learn that. And when we get into that situation, I'm going to rely on you to help me figure it out. We're going to work it out together, right? So again, even if you're more experienced than your players, I would like to believe that we are playing games with adults. Now, if you're not playing games with adults, disregard the rest of this advice. But it seems to me, and I know I've been proven wrong more than once, it seems to me that we should be able to trust our players to want to show up at the table and be ready, right? We want to trust our players to learn the mechanisms that they want to learn. We want to trust them to, if they're playing a wizard, be interested in wizard stuff and learn the wizard rules. Sometimes this doesn't work and it can lead to awkward situations though, right? Like, especially if you don't talk about it. If you just assume that a player will learn how their class works and what their abilities do, you can get in that position where you say, okay, player, how does magic work? And they say, I don't know. You're the GM. And then we all get uncomfortable because I didn't learn either. And the whole game grinds to a halt. Be clear about what you want from your players. If you want them to learn a mechanism, ask them to do that or ask them if they're willing to. I don't like playing with people who don't think about the game between sessions. Ideally, I would have my players like occasionally pick up the book and read the rules while they're having their morning coffee, or think about their character and imagine what advances they might want to take, or, come to the table with their new beliefs ready to go. But the reality is that we don't always have time in our lives for these things. Some players only think about the game when they're at the table. And you have to, as a GM and as a co-player, you have to decide whether that's okay for you. I tend to prefer players that are interested, but I will play with people who don't learn the rules because I understand that I'm always going to be a bigger RPG nerd than most of the players that I have in the games that I play. That's just the nature of the thing. So I'm aware of those limitations, but with a complex game like Burning Wheel, I will tell a player between now and the next session, can you please read and understand these rules? And if they say to me in good faith, yes, I will, I trust them. I let them do it. If they let me down, if they don't do the thing, I will remember that, okay, I can't trust them to do that. And I or another player will have to learn these rules to help them in those situations. Because again, we all engage with role-playing games differently. So when it really comes down to it, Paul, the signs that indicate it's safe to incorporate complicated stuff into the game is going to vary based on your preferences as a teacher and your group's preferences as learners. If they are eager and interested and they learn fast, you'll be able to introduce stuff more quickly. If they are less eager, struggle with the system, or just learn slower, give it more time, you're going to have to decide your preferences versus that time, right? If you really want them to learn fast, and you are getting frustrated, express that boundary. Say to them like, all right, guys, it's been 12 episodes. It's been 12 sessions. I'd really like to start using the more complicated stuff in the rules, but I'm feeling like you're not engaging with the system as much as is going to be required. Like, I don't think we're quite there yet. What can we do to get us there? What can we do? And they might say, we're just not interested in the system, in which case, wipe away your tears and go and find a new group that you can play Burning Wheel with. But hopefully you've hooked them. Hopefully your passion and the game itself have managed to hook them into the premise. If not, sometimes that's just how it goes. I think ultimately when it comes down to it, and I'm kind of diverging from the original question, but I think when it comes down to it, if you end up in a group where the players are less interested or less likely to learn than you are, you need to decide whether or not that is a hard boundary. It's like being in a relationship of any kind, right? This is where it turns into a hot for teacher. This is a hot for teacher sort of moment where if you're in a relationship with somebody and you value and you love them and you think they're great and you like being around them, but they do one thing that just really annoys you, right? Like maybe, I don't know, they leave the dishes in the sink and it just drives you bananas. And you say to them, hey, leaving the dishes in the sink really annoys me. And they keep doing it. They're now knowingly annoying you. They're doing something that is lowering the quality of your life. You have to decide whether or not you want to be in a relationship with them. In the same way, if you're 140 sessions into your long-running Dungeons and Dragons campaign and some of your players still don't know their abilities, you have to decide as a DM whether or not it bothers you enough to ask them to stop playing or whether you can just get over it and maybe have a chuckle and move on, right? Like in this example, obviously, if you watch Court of Swords, I'm sort of sideways teasing Max. But if it really bothered me that Max didn't have as big a handle on the mechanisms of the game, I would have told him. I would have given him shit about it a long time ago. But I obviously don't really care. And it's sort of become a fun joke. And he knows that when it comes up, when he doesn't remember a rule, yeah, we might tease him about it, but we don't mean any harm by it. We still want him in the game, and he brings a ton to the table. And it's not a boundary for anybody, but it might be for you, right? So this is one of those questions it's specific, but it's also hard to answer because everybody's group is different. So for you, there's going to be a moment, Paul, where your players all look at each other like, oh, we get it. I know how to get Artha from beliefs. I know how intent and task works. Nice. You'll see that revelation. And when it happens, that's the time to add in more stuff. But when that'll happen and how long it takes, that's going to vary based on your group, right? Now, our last question for today comes from Hawfunk and is a really interesting one. And like the first question, I kind of have to disclaim here. I can talk about the role-playing part of this question, but the brain chemistry stuff, that part I don't have quite a handle on. So you'll have to do a little more research if you want that. But let me read this question for Hawfunk and we will start talking about it. So Hawfunk says, thank you for office hours. It's been extremely helpful to me as a new DM. You're welcome, Hawfunk. My question is about dementia. I got into role-playing games specifically for my dad, who is slowly losing cognitive ability. The doctors have recommended, as a way to slow the progress, tabletop games, and it has the side benefit of building shared experiences for us all. We actually started with award-winning tabletop role-playing game Dungeon World, as I thought the lighter mechanics would be helpful, and they've had fun, but now he even has trouble remembering what's at his character's disposal, even when he has the character sheet in front of him. Is there a different way to DM, or even a different game that allows for building a common narrative without his need to remember the mechanics of the game? Thanks for your insight, Hawfunk. What a great question. Like it feels so like it's such a cool and like kind way of getting into role-playing games, right? To like find out that your dad has dementia and is losing cognitive ability, but the tabletop games might help. And then to be like, yes, I will learn how to play role-playing games so that I can engage with my family and we can have these experiences together. That is just, Hawfunk, you're a good person. That is a really, really cool thing to do and an incredibly sweet challenge to undertake. Hats off to you, Hawfunk. So I can try to give you some advice as a game master, thinking about introducing games and playing games with folks who maybe have trouble with more complex rule sets. I can't speak to how this interacts with dementia specifically, but like, mental health stuff in general. I have some personal anecdotes and theories, but none of them are about your specific situation, Hawfunk. So I would continue, and it sounds to me like you're the kind of person who's already going to do this. I would continue to engage with other people who have parents or family members with dementia, continue talking to them, have a support network, find a support group. of people who maybe aren't necessarily playing role-playing games with their parents, but who are engaging with them in the same way, who have the same desires that you do. Because when it comes down to it, Hawfunk, if you have a good experience, you can then share that with the community as well, right? You'll have people who will tell you, here's how I interact with my grandma or my mom or my dad and how we work together to help them engage with this. And it might be about going to the art gallery. It might be about watching a movie. It might be about making puzzles together or building models. And you can take advice from them, and then you'll be able to go back to that community and say, hey, I just had a really great tabletop session with my dad. Here's what I did. Here's what I struggled with. And here's my successes. So what's great about this is that not only, Hawfunk, are you helping your own family and your own experience, but you're in a position where you're going to be able to learn things that can help others. And I think that that is such a good place to be, right? You're going to be going through hard stuff. Having a parent with dementia is I can't even imagine, right? It's a very, very difficult challenge, especially if you're close to your family. And I love that you are using tabletop games to help bridge that gap. I think that's fantastic. So let's see what we can do to help Hawfunk. Now, if this is about memory, right? Remembering the rules, remembering what you need to do, remembering kind of all of the stuff that has come before. Yeah, obviously it takes complex games where there are a lot of moving pieces, kind of takes them off the table, right? So, you're not going to have a lot of luck necessarily with games like Pathfinder or Burning Wheel. You're likely to not have much success, even with complex, simple games like Fate or Dungeon World, because like you said, even though you have the character sheet in front of you and you can flip it over and you can look at things, it's not just about remembering the thing, it's about remembering the referent for the thing. So again, not a cognitive scientist or anything here, but when you're playing a role-playing game, your brain is inventing a narrative, right? You're thinking about even simple stuff. You're thinking about, where am I? Where are my friends and enemies? Where are the objects of the narrative space? Your brain is going full-on imagination mode, trying to stay in correlation with everyone else, right? Then you've also got a sub-processing part of your brain listening to both your own narrative and other people's narratives, waiting to hear the rules, waiting to hear things like attack or dodge, waiting to hear things like magic or melee, right? You're listening to see, oh, wait a second, there's a rule for that in the game, right? It's like when you're playing soccer, right? Part of your brain is looking around for all the players. It's looking for the ball. It's keeping cognitive awareness of the net. You're thinking about how your body is moving, right? But another part of your game is your brain is remembering the rules of the game. Part of your brain is saying, don't pick up the ball, right? Kick it through the goal. Like you're engaging that memory part, trying to remember not only the rules, but in a role-playing game, where to find those rules. So if you haven't already internalized them, you are now trying to remember, okay, I think there's a rule for this. Where is that rule? What kind of rule is it? What am I supposed to do? And where do I find it? So even if all your rules are on your character sheet, knowing that A, it's a rule, and B, it's on my sheet in a specific place, there can be a disconnect there, right? So my suggestion would be find a game that has as few rules as possible, that requires as little reference as possible. And the first things that came to mind for me were For the Queen, right? So For the Queen and what is it called? Fall of Magic, right? Fall of Magic, For the Queen. Both really excellent games with zero reference required. You do not have to refer to anything except a piece of inspirational art or a big scroll map and where some tokens are on that map, right? Find the minimum amount of stuff. Now, you can also play a game that has a more active guide role, not necessarily a GM role, but a guide role, right? So in this circumstance, you have somebody who can tell the players what to do at any given time. I'm thinking of the thing I have in my head is Microscope. because Microscope is designed such that you could play it with a group of players that never interact with the rules directly and a single player who facilitates that play, right? A player who says, okay, all right, Mom, it's your turn. You need to pick one of these cards and then tell us a story about that card. And then all Mom has to do is look at the cards on the table and say, okay, I'm going to pick the War Against the Dinosaurs. I'm going to tell a story about the War Against the Dinosaurs. And then you say, okay, Mom, you picked your period. Do you want to tell a story about an individual scene within that story, or do you want to add a new story, right? Having those things that allow you to be the rules for your parents, for your siblings, for whoever you're playing with, so they know they can simply ask you and you are the referent. You become their Siri, right? You become their assistant in this regard, right? So Microscope is an option. There are a lot of LARPs. I don't know if LARPing is something that you and your family want to do, but oh boy, would it make Thanksgiving dinner very different if you all played Inheritance, right? Now, a lot of LARPs are going to involve like emotional content that maybe your family is not comfortable with or won't have fun with. But I think if you look into some of these, you can look into parlor LARPs or small scale LARPs, games that can take place over the course of a couple of hours. You're going to have to do a little more research, right, to find games that are going to fit. But there's some pretty fun, cool little experimental LARP games that you could play with your family that require no remembrance of any rules, really. You just have to remember who you are, right? So I think the thing here is that you are going to, Hoffunk, as game master or as facilitator, right? You're going to have to take on a role that is slightly less, you have slightly less opportunity than the other players to turn the responsibility over to them for the rules, right? Like Roscoe and Paul today, they can lean into their group to help them learn the game, but you're not going to be in a position where you can say, all right, Dad, I need you to remember the fight rules for me, right? You can take on that cognitive load for your dad, right? So you can do that. So you can say, Dad, if you ever have any questions or if you're not sure what you can do, please ask me. That's part of my job, right? Is answering that question. And again, getting your players to engage in question asking and to engage in that process with you is a really valuable way to build the narrative, right? Because curiosity fuels role-playing games, curiosity and choice. And so if you tell your dad, don't worry, you don't need to learn any of the rules. You can just ask me for them and I'll tell you what dice to roll. You can do that. So if you wanted, this is a place where you could play a game like Dungeon World or like Fate. And instead of giving your dad the character sheet, you could come up with another way to angle into the game by creating your own character sheets, right? So you could work with your dad and you could say, okay, Dad, what kind of character would you like to play? Do you want to play a healer? Do you want to play a brave warrior? Do you want to play a strange wizard, right? Give your dad the general gist and then walk your dad through the process of character creation, but you don't have to make it about stats, right? You can say, okay, do you want to be stronger or faster? Do you want to be smarter or wiser, right? Go through a sort of Q&A with your dad, and maybe you're doing the mechanics on the back end, but you're giving your dad a list of things about your character. So you could say, all right, Dad, you're Throndir, the elven fighter, right? You're a fighting elf. Your name is Throndir. That's what you picked from the list. You have gold hair and blue eyes. You're strong, but not very fast. You're smart, but not very wise. And you're charismatic, but kind of frail, right? So creating those like easy structures and then basically treating the game like it is World of Dungeons, right? Describing the situation to your dad and saying, okay, all right, Dad, what does Throndir do? What do you want to do in this situation? And if your dad says, I don't know, what can I do? You can offer up some suggestions, right? You could say, well, the troll is blocking the door and you want to get through. So what do you think? Do you want to fight? Do you want to fight with the troll, or would you like to try to trick him? Maybe you want to slide between his legs, but you don't have to ask your dad to remember hack and slash, volley, parlay, you're saying, how do you solve this problem, Thron Dad? And then Thron Dad would be like, I'd like to shoot him with my bow, son. And you're like, awesome. So grab those 2d6 and you roll them and you tell him what you get. And then Dad rolls, gets an 8, and you say, all right, Dad, you got some choices. You draw an arrow and you fire it. And one of these things can happen, because then what you're doing is you're basically just walking your Padre through a series of gated questions. And then as your dad becomes comfortable with that, you can slowly turn over more responsibility or more of the character sheet to your dad. And there could be a fun moment where you say, all right, Dad, so up until now, I've been doing a lot of the work for you, but I think you're understanding that there are certain outcomes from certain actions. Well, let me show you how that works. And you can say, okay, Dad, so whenever you've been fighting a monster, I've been using hack and slash. And you can show your dad the move and you can explain to him, this is what I've been doing. Now you can do it, right? And so in the next session, when you say, all right, Dad, you see a couple of orcs and they're blocking the road, your dad knows well enough now to say, I hack and slash. Or he's got this comfortable protocol built up where he can look at you and say, I don't know, what are my options? And you can say, all right, Dad, here's what you could do, right? So there are places where you're going to likely limit, and I'm saying this in sarcastic quotation marks because really you're just giving them options. But I do this as a GM for Dungeon World already, where I'll say to somebody, what do you want to do? And if they hesitate or if they're not sure, I say, you could do this or that. How about this thing? What do you think of that? And sometimes just being poked a little bit or pushed a little bit, sometimes that can help. Now, I'm seeing a lot of advice in chat about helping people with dementia in general. I don't feel super comfortable necessarily like repeating that advice or talking about like how to engage with folks with dementia. Obviously, as a person whose father has been diagnosed with dementia, you are doing some research. I'm sure people are offering you books and blogs and YouTube videos to watch. And I'm not going to load any more on that because I don't have any concrete advice and I haven't experienced that. But I bet you, as a fledgling game master and as somebody who's obviously doing your research on this side, I bet you as you do your research into helping your dad move through his new life, I think you're going to find some things that you're going to be like, wait a second, I can use that in a role-playing game, right? So keep your eyes and ears open, metaphorically, to things that might be able to cross those boundaries, right, between role-playing game and other advice. And, you know, this is the thing that we do all the time as GMs, right? We look to other disciplines. We look to movies. We look to cartoons. We look to manga. We look to theater. We look to all sorts of other things for advice for how to become better at role-playing games. So in this case, there's some crossover there already, right? And I think it's going to make you a better GM regardless. Yeah. Thank you, Hofunk. And thank you also, Paul and Roscoe, for your questions today. This has been episode number 93 of Office Hours. Thank you for coming, everybody. And if you have a question, please don't be shy. Just pile them on. We can't do a show without questions, so don't be shy. Come and give them to me. www.adam-koble.com. There is an Office Hours link. Click on it, fill out the form. You can submit your voice if you want to. You don't have to. I like being able to hear it. And in the future, I will continue answering questions about tabletop role-playing games right here on Office Hours. But for now, that's it for me. I'll see you next time for more Office Hours. Bye, everybody.